The institution did not measure its strength by what it held. It measured it by what it could continue holding. Most organizations build vaults to protect assets. This one built its vault to protect continuity. The difference was not semantic. Assets fluctuate. Continuity compounds. The central archive was located beneath the main administrative complex, extending downward through multiple reinforced levels. Each level contained documented decisions, fiscal instruments, strategic forecasts, acquisition records, and policy frameworks spanning decades. Yet below the documented layers existed another chamber not referenced in structural diagrams distributed to staff. This chamber was not hidden in secrecy. It was hidden in assumption. Those who worked above believed the archive had limits, finite shelves, finite digital capacity, finite oversight bandwidth. They believed expansion required trade-offs. Space consumed elsewhere must be reclaimed. The chamber beneath challenged that belief. It was referred to internally, without announcement, as the infinite vault. The term did not imply boundless physical space. It referred to an architectural philosophy. Nothing essential would ever be discarded. Nothing foundational would be compressed beyond traceability. If capacity was strained, infrastructure expanded. Memory did not yield to convenience. The infinite vault operated under a simple premise. Decisions accumulate leverage only when their lineage remains intact. The authority responsible for maintaining the vault had held that responsibility long enough to observe cycles of ambition rise and subside. Efficiency initiatives emerged every few years. Modernization proposals promised acceleration. Digitization strategies claimed liberation from physical constraints. Each initiative was evaluated. None were rejected outright. They were absorbed into structure. Above the vault, a newly appointed strategic executive began restructuring operational divisions. The appointment followed an era of stable but unremarkable growth. Stakeholders desired momentum. The executive delivered it. Within the first year, reporting hierarchies were flattened. Decision pathways shortened. Interdepartmental approvals were consolidated into unified task forces. Performance metrics responded positively. Speed increased. Costs decreased. Recognition followed. The executive did not display arrogance. Communication remained composed. The restructuring proposals were accompanied by thorough documentation and financial justification. Efficiency, in isolation, is difficult to dispute. The first proposal touching archival structure arrived during the second year. The executive suggested implementing a rolling archival purge protocol for non-critical legacy data. The argument was pragmatic. Storage costs were rising. Retrieval systems were strained by historical depth. Artificial intelligence tools required streamlined datasets to operate effectively. Legacy redundancy was framed as operational drag. The infinite vault was not referenced in the proposal. Only the visible archive layers were discussed. The authority overseeing the vault reviewed the proposal without immediate response. The logic was technically sound. Data classification models identified materials not accessed within 15 years. Automated risk assessments categorized them as low impact. Deletion would not alter present operations. Deletion would simplify predictive modeling. The executive proposed phased implementation over 12 months, beginning with pre-digital fiscal records. No urgency was expressed. Confidence replaced urgency. The oversight authority requested a pilot study before authorization. The pilot would simulate archival reduction without actual deletion. Data would be flagged, isolated, and functionally hidden from operational retrieval while preserved within a separate containment environment. The executive agreed. Simulation began. Within weeks, analytic models trained on the streamlined dataset produced sharper projections. Processing time decreased. Strategic forecasting sessions became more efficient. Reports appeared cleaner. Operational teams praised the clarity. What was absent from the streamlined dataset were the peripheral debates that had preceded past pivots. the marginal dissent that had influenced cautious amendments, the aborted initiatives that had informed future safeguards. Those materials were categorized as low impact. Impact is often evaluated against present variables. Present variables rarely anticipate recurrence. During the third month of the pilot, a market anomaly surfaced, minor but unfamiliar in its pattern. Analysts referenced predictive models generated from the streamlined dataset. The anomaly appeared manageable. Within the infinite vault, preserved historical records contained an analogous event from decades earlier. The archived debate surrounding that event revealed secondary effects that had not manifested until 18 months after initial stabilization. Those secondary effects were absent from the streamlined model. The oversight authority retrieved the archived context and presented it during internal risk assessment, not as correction, but as augmentation. The executive listened without resistance. Additional safeguards were incorporated into the anomaly response. The event resolved without disruption. The pilot continued. Efficiency metrics remained strong. However, a quiet divergence began to form. Operational teams, accustomed to streamlined datasets, increasingly referenced predictive models over archival precedent. Historical context was consulted only when flagged by oversight. Dependency on models grew. Dependency reduces inquiry. The executive proposed accelerating the purge protocol timeline based on pilot success indicators. Storage cost projections justified expansion. Forecasting accuracy improvements were documented. The oversight authority did not deny the improvements. Instead, a structural question was introduced. What defines non-critical? The executive responded with tiered classification matrices. Thresholds were defined by frequency of access, financial materiality, regulatory relevance. The framework was comprehensive. It did not account for latent relevance. Latent relevance is invisible until triggered. The oversight authority expanded the pilot parameters. Rather than deleting legacy data, it would be compressed into a lower-tier storage environment within the infinite vault, retained, but excluded from primary analytic feeds. The executive agreed again. Compression began. Legacy debates were indexed but deprioritized. Historical dissent was archived beyond operational dashboards. The infinite vault absorbed the volume without strain. Above, analytic efficiency improved further. Speed creates momentum. Momentum influences perception of authority. Stakeholders began associating progress with reduction. Simplification was interpreted as advancement. Public communications highlighted modernization efforts. The infinite vault remained silent. It did not resist compression. It contained it. By the end of the pilot year, operational leadership perceived archival depth as adjustable variable rather than foundational constant. That perception marked the first imbalance. The executive believed optimization required subtraction. The vault understood that optimization required expansion. The difference was philosophical, not procedural. Philosophical differences rarely surface immediately. They accumulate. The executive prepared a full-scale archival reduction proposal for board review. It outlined projected 5-year savings, analytic acceleration benefits, and integration with machine learning systems. The proposal was structured meticulously. Deletion was no longer simulated. It was scheduled. The oversight authority reviewed the document in silence. No objection was drafted. Instead, a supplemental annex was appended for board consideration, continuity risk evaluation. The annex did not oppose modernization. It quantified potential cost of lost lineage. It modeled scenarios in which archived dissent prevented structural failure. It referenced case studies, drawn from the infinite vault, where preserved context mitigated cascading error. The board reviewed both documents concurrently. Deliberation extended beyond scheduled duration. Approval was deferred pending further structural analysis. Deferral was not denial. It was compression. The executive maintained composure publicly. Confidence remained. The modernization narrative continued. Below, the infinite vault expanded infrastructure quietly, anticipating increased compression if approval eventually materialized. The imbalance was no longer about storage. It was about ideology. One viewed the past as overhead. The other viewed it as leverage. Neither position declared conflict. Yet beneath procedural civility, architectural tension intensified. The infinite vault had no visible boundaries, but its limits were being tested. Board deliberation did not conclude quickly. The modernization proposal remained active, but its trajectory slowed under the weight of additional analysis. Independent advisors were commissioned to evaluate long-term governance risk associated with archival reduction. Financial consultants projected measurable cost savings. Risk analysts produced probabilistic assessments with conditional qualifiers. The executive continued presenting optimization as inevitability. The oversight authority continued presenting continuity as infrastructure. Neither position escalated rhetorically. The compression occurred in the space between projections and precedent. During this period, operational divisions intensified reliance on streamlined datasets. Predictive models, now embedded into weekly strategic meetings, became primary reference points. Dashboards displayed trends without historical footnotes. Confidence in algorithmic output grew as forecasts aligned with short-term outcomes. Accuracy reinforces authority. Authority consolidates through repetition. The infinite vault, meanwhile, accumulated compressed legacy records relocated during pilot phases. These records were preserved intact, but removed from real-time analytic feeds. Access required deliberate retrieval rather than automatic inclusion. Retrieval frequency declined. Convenience influences behavior more than directive. 6 months into extended review, the executive introduced a modified proposal. Instead of permanent deletion, legacy archives would be transferred to a third-party cold storage provider under long-term contract. Retrieval would remain technically possible, though costlier and slower. The reframing softened optics. Data would not vanish. It would recede. The oversight authority requested simulation modeling of retrieval latency impact during crisis scenarios. Consultants projected minimal disruption under normal conditions. Under extreme volatility, however, delayed access could compound uncertainty. The board requested additional modeling. Time continued to stretch. Within the organization, impatience remained contained but perceptible. Storage infrastructure expansion costs had risen. Analytics teams advocated for cleaner datasets. Efficiency had become expectation. Expectation exerts pressure. The executive responded by tightening operational workflows unrelated to archival debate. Procurement cycles shortened further. Vendor renegotiations yielded incremental savings. Performance reviews adopted sharper metrics. Visible progress continued. Momentum persisted. The oversight authority observed the pattern carefully. Modernization had expanded beyond storage. It now defined culture. In response, a new governance mechanism was introduced: historical impact audits. These audits required that any major strategic initiative reference at least 3 historical precedents from within the infinite vault, outlining parallels and divergences. The mechanism applied universally, not selectively. The first audit session exposed subtle gaps. Several initiatives lacked awareness of analogous past efforts preserved in compressed archives. Once surfaced, these precedents revealed overlooked variables, regulatory nuances, behavioral resistance patterns, supplier instability cycles. Adjustments were made. No initiative was halted, but none moved unchanged. The executive acknowledged the audit process publicly, framing it as reinforcement rather than resistance. Yet the pace of modernization slowed under cumulative documentation requirements. Compression shifted direction. Efficiency now encountered structural density. During a quarterly earnings review, a minor discrepancy appeared between projected and realized margins in one division heavily optimized under streamlined analytics. The deviation was not catastrophic, but it contradicted model confidence intervals. Analysis traced the discrepancy to an assumption embedded within the predictive model, an assumption originally debated and cautiously limited in archival records decades earlier. That debate resided in compressed legacy files, not active dashboards. The oversight authority retrieved the debate transcript and presented it in post-review session. The executive listened without interruption. The model was recalibrated. Confidence in pure streamlining weakened slightly, not publicly, internally. Over the following months, external market volatility increased gradually. Nothing abrupt, nothing dramatic, just incremental unpredictability across supply chains and regulatory interpretations. The executive's modernization narrative adjusted tone, emphasizing resilience alongside efficiency. Resilience requires redundancy. Redundancy contradicts deletion. The board reconvened to revisit the archival proposal in light of environmental instability. Financial arguments remained persuasive, yet risk modeling had grown more complex. Advisors cautioned that historical depth provided optionality during nonlinear shifts. Optionality has intangible value. Intangible value resists quantification. The oversight authority proposed a structural compromise, not reduction, not static preservation, but expansion. The Infinite Vault would integrate advanced indexing technology to enhance accessibility without subtracting content. Rather than shrinking memory, the institution would increase its capacity to navigate it. Expansion requires investment. Investment counters cost-saving narrative. The executive evaluated the proposal carefully. Publicly, it could be positioned as technological leadership rather than archival resistance. Privately, it signaled philosophical divergence. The board approved funding for enhanced indexing pilot. Implementation began within the vault's lower tiers. Machine learning tools were trained not on compressed datasets, but on full contextual archives. Algorithms learned to identify descent patterns, contingency triggers, and latent risk markers across decades of preserved deliberation. Initial results were revealing. Predictive accuracy improved, not through subtraction, but through deeper pattern recognition across extended lineage. The executive reviewed analytic reports generated from full context models. They were slower to produce. They required more computational power, but they detected correlations previously invisible within streamlined datasets. Detection alters confidence. Confidence recalibrates authority. Operational teams, exposed to enhanced models, began requesting contextual overlays voluntarily. The habit of referencing compressed dashboards persisted, but contextual augmentation became competitive advantage in strategic discussions. The Infinite Vault was no longer silent infrastructure. It was analytic engine. The compression that had once threatened deletion now pressed in opposite direction, toward integration. The executive recognized the shift. Optimization through reduction had encountered optimization through expansion. Board deliberation concluded with revised directive. No permanent deletion of archival material would occur. Cold storage outsourcing was rejected. Instead, archival depth would be designated strategic asset, with dedicated budget lines separate from operational expense. The decision did not repudiate modernization. It reframed it. The executive remained in position. Authority intact. Portfolio expansive. Yet modernization now required coexistence with infinite retention philosophy. Coexistence imposes constraint. Constraint stabilizes trajectory. Months later, during internal leadership summit, the executive presented the enhanced indexing results personally. The narrative emphasized evolution rather than compromise. Archival depth was described as competitive mode. Language aligned. Philosophy adjusted. The Infinite Vault expanded again, physically and digitally, without announcement. Infrastructure investments increased storage capacity beyond projected 20-year needs. The imbalance that had once favored subtraction now favored accumulation. not accumulation for its own sake. Accumulation with navigable structure. The executive continued advancing initiatives, but proposals now incorporated contextual modeling as standard component. Deletion was no longer discussed. Reduction had been absorbed. Acceleration had been tempered. Authority persisted, but its direction had changed. The infinite vault did not defeat modernization. It redefined it. The final transition did not announce itself. There was no visible restructuring, no overt declaration of supremacy. The institution continued to function under the same external design: identical walls, identical corridors, identical procedures. From the outside, the hierarchy appeared unchanged. Reports were filed. Meetings occurred. Instructions moved downward in predictable rhythm. Yet beneath that surface continuity, something essential had been sealed. The one who once controlled access no longer controlled interpretation. That distinction remained unnoticed by most. Authority still wore the same posture, delivered directives with the same cadence. But the atmosphere around it had altered. Words that previously landed with force now dispersed without resistance. Not through defiance, not through rebellion, simply through redirection. Power had shifted from position to perimeter. The recalibration began with silence. Where reaction had once been immediate, it was now measured. Where compliance had once been direct, it was now filtered. Responses were no longer attempts to appease or resist. They were calibrated adjustments, neither submissive nor confrontational. The superior structure continued issuing pressure. But pressure requires friction to register. Without friction, it passes through. That absence created a subtle vacuum. The central authority began sensing distance without identifying its source. Instructions were executed, yet outcomes no longer reinforced dominance. Decisions were respected, yet their emotional impact diminished. The feedback loop that once validated superiority no longer returned the same affirmation. Nothing had been challenged, nothing had been denied, but nothing reinforced either. The corridor outside the vault remained dimly lit, polished stone reflecting controlled light. The vault itself stood unchanged, heavy door, layered steel, impenetrable presence. It symbolized finality, security, irrevocability. For years, access to that vault had defined the hierarchy. Now the vault's symbolic value weakened. Because control over entry is not the same as control over meaning. The subtle strategist did not seek entry anymore. That pursuit had been relinquished deliberately. Instead, attention shifted to flow. How information moved before it approached the vault. How perception formed before authorization was granted. Control was exercised earlier in the chain. The superior authority noticed discrepancies in tone first. Interactions that once carried tension now carried composure. Where intimidation had previously produced visible restraint, it now produced calm acknowledgement. No resistance, no appeasement, only stillness. Stillness unsettles structures built on reaction. Pressure intensified quietly. Deadlines shortened. Oversight increased. Minor corrections were magnified. These adjustments were attempts to recover friction, to provoke the familiar confirmation of dominance. But every attempt encountered the same measured response: precision, clarity, absence of emotional investment. The environment began adapting around that composure. Others within the structure observed without commentary. Influence spreads not through proclamation, but through imitation. The restrained posture, once isolated, became ambient. Meetings grew quieter. Exchanges became concise. The atmosphere lost volatility. The superior authority interpreted this as efficiency. It was containment. The infinite vault, once guarded as the ultimate instrument of control, began losing its psychological leverage. It remained physically secure. It remained symbolically significant. But it no longer generated anticipation. Anticipation is power. Without it, even the most fortified structure becomes architecture rather than dominance. The strategist understood this transition without celebrating it. Celebration signals victory. Victory invites counterattack. Instead, the shift was treated as maintenance. A series of small recalibrations continued: redistribution of responsibilities, refinement of language, subtle reframing of objectives. None of these actions contradicted authority. They aligned with it, yet redirected its force. When instructions arrived, they were executed with heightened clarity. Not faster, not slower, more exact. Precision eliminates interpretive control. The superior authority began encountering outcomes that matched its directives precisely, sometimes too precisely. Ambiguity had once allowed it to expand or reinterpret results. Now outcomes left no room for revision. Control requires elasticity. Precision removes elasticity. The imbalance inverted. Where once the superior authority shaped perception, it now reacted to frameworks already stabilized. Conversations shifted tone. The strategist no longer spoke to defend position, nor to assert it. Statements were delivered as observations rather than proposals. Observations require no approval. Gradually, the center of gravity moved. The institution continued to function, unaware of the tectonic shift beneath it. To outsiders, the hierarchy appeared intact. To insiders, something intangible had solidified. The vault door remained closed, but its importance diminished, because the most critical space was no longer behind steel. It was internal. The strategist had constructed an infinite vault, one without hinges, without visible walls, without dependency on access. It was built from restraint, measured response, and controlled detachment. No external authority could enter it. No external authority could withhold it. This realization marked the irreversible threshold. The superior authority sensed loss without evidence. Attempts to reassert dominance became subtler. Suggestions framed as mentorship, inquiries framed as collaboration. The tone softened. Softening signaled recognition. The strategist responded consistently, respectful, unprovoked, unwavering. No claim was made. No triumph displayed. Dominance unannounced is dominance secured. Eventually, the dynamic stabilized into a new equilibrium. The superior authority retained its formal title. Decisions continued to bear its signature. But the emotional dependency that once fueled its position had dissolved. Power no longer flowed toward it seeking validation. It circulated independently. In meetings, silence began carrying weight from a different direction. When the strategist spoke, it was rarely to oppose. It was to clarify. Clarification narrowed ambiguity, leaving little space for manipulation. The institution adapted around that clarity. Subtle alliances formed, not declared, not formalized, simply alignments of posture. People gravitate toward stability. Stability had shifted location. The superior authority remained in place, but it was no longer central. The vault door, once a symbol of final decision, became ceremonial. Its presence reminded others of an earlier configuration of power, one based on access and exclusion. The infinite vault required no ceremony. It required only consistency. The strategist understood that permanence depends on invisibility. If the shift became visible, it could be challenged. Therefore, visibility was avoided. Responsibilities were carried without display. Influence was exercised without acknowledgement. The transformation remained embedded in process rather than narrative. Time passed. With each cycle of instruction and execution, the new hierarchy entrenched itself further, not through overt replacement, but through quiet redundancy. The superior authority's leverage gradually reduced to formal obligation. Eventually, pressure ceased. Not because defeat was declared, because dominance was no longer effective. A system cannot coerce what does not seek approval. The final moment did not occur in a confrontation. It occurred in an absence. A directive was issued. It no longer generated tension. That absence confirmed completion. The strategist did not alter behavior afterward. No expansion, no assertion, The equilibrium had been achieved through subtraction, not addition. The infinite vault remained intact, self-contained, inaccessible, independent of external validation. It required no key, because it had never depended on one. The institution continued functioning. From a distance, nothing had changed. Titles remained identical. Structures remained intact. Yet the architecture of influence had been rewritten. The superior authority still occupied its office, but it no longer occupied the center. Silence settled, not as emptiness, but as containment. Contained systems are stable. Stable systems endure. The strategist understood this without reflection. The shift was irreversible not because it was dramatic, but because it was structural. What had once been a hierarchy based on access had become a hierarchy based on composure. Composure cannot be revoked. And so the vault, once finite, guarded, symbolic, was replaced by something infinite and internal. No door, no hinge, no key, only control.